So essentially, I'll begin with me. I am a mum of two, and I'm a journalist and an author. And I was born in a tiny little country right down the bottom of South America called Uruguay. And if anybody enjoys literature, they'll know that magic realism is the genre that came out of South America. And I kind of feel like my interest in the spirit world and mysteries and marvels has something to do with my heritage. Uruguay only has about 3 million people. It's a tiny little place wedged in between the giants of Brazil and Argentina. Its immigration is primarily European, and I did my ancestry DNA recently, and I've got such a melting pot of Portuguese and Spanish and French and Italian, and all of those things I think have contributed to my passion in this world of mysteries and marvels, as I like to call it. So, interesting story is that I almost died in my mother's womb, and it's a fascinating story that I tell in my third book, Love Never Dies, and it's very much a kind of Gabriel Garcia Marquez kind of story. But my mother was pregnant with me, and they were all sitting in the kitchen of my grandmother's home in Montevideo, and my godfather, who was my mother's dearest, most beloved cousin, he was grieving because his father, a very robust young man in his early 40s, had passed away suddenly to everyone's horror of a heart attack. So my mother's cousin, his name is Roberto, he was just beside himself with grief, and he was not himself. And so on this day, it was a winter's afternoon, my mum, my dad, my grandfather, and perhaps one other person were sitting around the kitchen table in Uruguay in my grandmother's kitchen, and they were enjoying a drink called mate, which is a tea that Uruguayans and Argentinians drink, and you drink it out of a steel straw, and it's a communal thing which you pass around and would not be acceptable in the days of Corona, I'm sure. And that was happening, and the table was laden with lots of yummy treats that Uruguayans have, pastries and all sorts of things. And then my godfather walked in, Roberto, and he had his father's antique rifle in his hand. And he said, "Look at what I found. Look, it's Dad's," and his dad had recently passed away, as I said. And the mood kind of darkened in the kitchen, and my mum, who was very close to him, said, "Oh, put that away, you don't worry about that right now." And he said, No, but I just want to show you, look at it, it's amazing. It's not loaded," he said. And at that, he cocked it and actually went to pull the trigger. And my dad, who was sitting next to my mum, he just went, because my godfather's nickname was Gordo, the chubby one. And he goes, "Oh, Gordo," and he pushed the butt of the rifle away a few centimeters, and a bullet did fire, and it went right through my grandfather's kitchen door. And I actually got to see the bullet hole many years later when we visited Uruguay, and I was a child. So I think that was a near-death experience, or an exit point, or I don't know what you want to call it, but perhaps it helped also form that fascination with the afterlife that I've had, because I very nearly was there before I was even born. So from there, my family immigrated to Sydney when I was 2 years old. So we came here, and I think I would have been about 7 when I began to sort of have a consciousness of this sense that there was more to life than what our physical senses showed us. And a big part of that was stories that my mum shared. So I don't know how old I was when I first heard that story of what my godfather did, but there were other stories that my mum shared, and they had to do with premonitions and sensing the imminent deaths of loved ones. For instance, that uncle of hers that I mentioned, Roberto's father, my mother had a premonition of his death minutes before the alarm was raised that he'd collapsed and had a heart attack. My mum declared it. So she was in the kitchen making schnitzels, and she suddenly said, "Turn down the music, Uncle is dead." And then minutes later, my grandfather came rushing in. Their houses were adjoining. So Roberto's dad lived just behind my grandparents. And yes, my mother's prediction minutes earlier was true. So there was that story. And there was another very poignant story that my mother shared with me. And again, I don't remember at what age, but I was probably, you know, a small child. And this had to do with her small cousin, Yolanda. So my mum was a girl of about 16. She worked at a boutique in the city. And there was one day where she thought, I've got to get out of here. I've got to go and visit Yolanda. And it was a very strange thing for her to say, because my mum was, as I said, a teenager. Yolanda was 4 years old. And she was a cousin that my mum didn't really get to see that much. And teenagers, you know, it was just an odd thing for my mother to say. But so strong was this compulsion to go and see her little cousin Yolanda that she told her boss. She said, I just must leave. And she had a very good work ethic. So the boss thought, well, this must be very urgent. And she left and she went home to her home, and she told my grandmother, her mum, she said, we have to go see Yolanda. We have to go see her right now. And so my grandmother collected her sister, who, as I said, lived behind her. And the three of them went to go and see Yolanda. And it was a bus ride away. And when they got there, they saw Yolanda's mum sitting out on the porch drinking that tea that I mentioned, mate, and nothing seemed awry. Everything seemed quite normal. And the ladies stopped to speak right there on the porch. And Yolanda, my mum, went straight through the house to find her little cousin. And she found her. She was in bed. Now, to give some background, all that was known about Yolanda at that moment was that she hadn't been well, but nobody knew quite why or what had happened. But that was all. Certainly it wasn't something that was discussed. And so Yolanda was in bed. My mum went to her bedside, and Yolanda said, I need to go to the bathroom. And my mum said, I'll help you. And so she helped her get into her little slippers, and she shuffled off to the toilet. And then when she came back, my mum tucked her back into bed. And remember, my mum was a girl of 16. And Yolanda just looked at her and said, I'm scared. And then with that, a little trickle of blood came out of her mouth, and she died, with my mum holding her hand. What emerged later was that the little girl had leukemia, and there was something that was done in those days, which they thought was a mercy to spare the mum grief. So they had told sort of senior members of the doctors, I mean, had told senior members of the family, but not Yolanda's mum, that she was, you know, imminently to die. So they thought that that was a kind thing to do. But that was a story that obviously piqued my imagination, you know, as a little kid, as well as the premonition of her uncle's death. And with that, there was other things. Let's see, I was, at around the same time, I kind of had the knowledge that I would be a writer. And I began to write poems, and I lost myself in books, many books. I loved Enid Blyton's series, The Faraway Tree. I loved, you know, anything to do with mysteries and marvels. So back then, Woolies would sell these cheap true story paperbacks. And, you know, when I'd go shopping with my parents, we'd pop them in I would just grab them from the aisle and pop a couple in the trolley. And they had titles like True Life Ghost Stories or The World's Scariest Hauntings and all things like that. And they were just, I've still got a couple actually. And I would just love them. I'd devour them, these true stories. And to me, they didn't scare me. It wasn't the scare that I was after. For me, there was always a sense of awe and reverence and excitement. It was actually a bit of excitement. It was the excitement of possibility, of what is invisible to us, that is right there, but we just cannot access it. And I knew innately that this was of great importance, and that I had to stay connected to it. I don't think I had knowledge back then that my life path would take me through to writing and speaking about these things, but I just knew that this was something I had to remember. And there's a beautiful Welsh word called hiraeth, and that means to long for a home that you don't know of, or a home that you don't remember. And there was that sense that there was somewhere, something that I belonged to, and it was through this connection with these stories of, you know, my mum's and the stories that I read about in the Woolies paperbacks. That was the way that I connected with this home that I belonged to. So reading, writing, you know, I grew up a teenager. A lot of that got pushed aside, you know, the years of forming the personality and the ego takes over. And, you know, the teenage and the early 20s are very physical years where you're learning your physical boundaries, and there's great sort of focus on the physical self. But still, you know, it was all in the back of my head. As a child, another thing I remember that was key to that time, from, you know, those primary school years, was my parents would have seances. Now, I've written about this in Love Never Dies because, in a way, the seances were connecting with the old country and with the loved ones they'd left behind. Again, there was nothing frightening about these homemade Ouija boards. So, for instance, we'd go visit friends, and these were also Uruguayan immigrants, and us kids would run around, and you know, the grown-ups would be behind closed doors, and we'd peek and have a look, and there they were, you know, with the upturned wine glass and the homemade letters and numbers, and they were trying to connect with the people they'd left behind. And so I guess early on I made the connection between the spirit world and love, you know. And other funny things, you know, when I was a kid in the early 80s, there was the Amityville Horror came out, and there was Jaws as well, which is not paranormal, but to me, they're kind of all bundled together. And, you know, I had this understanding that, again, like, well, basically my innate understanding of the spirit world was just continually affirmed. And then one really key moment was when I was about 8, and I read somewhere in one of my books that one distant day the sun would swallow up the earth, or it would blow up, and the sun would blow up and the earth would be no more. And that led to many a night lying awake, staring up at the ceiling, just feeling this deep sense of panic, and also something that I can't even describe, like a sense of trying to imagine that nothingness. And I actually could not imagine this nothingness. It was impossible. And my stomach would kind of tie itself up in knots trying to think of this emptiness. And it was this idea of the spirit world that helped draw me out of that panic that I experienced as a little kid, you know. I wasn't panicked anymore when I thought, no, but look at the stories. Look at the stories that I'm reading in these books, and mum's stories. No, there's more. I just can't see it. So that was essentially my primary school years. And then, as I said, grew up, kind of set it aside, dabbled a little bit, as, you know, teens do with the Ouija board, but mainly that was just me and my friends squealing. And, you know, we can talk more about the Ouija board later, because it comes up in lots of my interviews that I've done over the years. And certainly it can be, in the right circumstances, something very, very dangerous. But nothing happened for me. And it was only a couple of times that we just laughed and squealed when the thing moved, and that was it. And then I got married. I had my first child, and then 18 months later, my second. And my husband and I, my children, lived in a little Californian bungalow in Rockdale, which is a suburb near the airport in Sydney. And the house was built in the 20s. We'd never had any problems or anything in that home in terms of paranormal nature. But then one day, my husband began to see spirits looking as real as flesh and blood people. And this was something unexpected. It was, well, we thought at the time that it just came out of the blue, but we went on to find out that he'd actually begun to meditate just for some peace of mind. He's a very energetic person, and he just needed to just take it down a notch. So he started to meditate of an evening, and the apparitions emerged after that. So the first thing that happened was that he was watching television late one night, and something drew his eye to the left, and standing within 2 meters was this lovely little boy, just peeking his face around the threshold of our living room and the kitchen. It was a little cottage, and he was just standing there, and he was sentient. He was communicating with my husband. He was cheeky. He had a cheeky spirit. And my husband said he was not at all scared of him. He just thought, oh my gosh, look at that. He was just filled with wonder, really. He said the boy was, he looked real, except he was all sort of in greyish and sepia tones. So he didn't have the vibrant colours of just a person standing there. But he would go on to see a spirit in the house that did look exactly like a flesh and blood human. So that was the first. And then he saw a lady, again, like he's up late watching TV, very awake. He's just watching the sport. And a lady just strides across our corridor, and she was wearing a red, what looked like a red nightgown is how he described it. And then, so this all happened in the space of 2 weeks. The last one he saw was a spirit that was so real. He actually thought she was our daughter, who was a little child of about 6 at the time. And he saw a little girl in white with long blonde hair, and she was so real. He thought that was our daughter Jasmine. And for that spirit, I was awake, and it was at dusk when he saw her. It wasn't even nighttime, and he ran in to tell me, oh my gosh, I've just seen this. And so within that time that was happening in our home, I didn't see them, but I sensed the presence. I sensed something had changed in our home. We now had, there was just the sense of, I sort of describe it as the air before a thunderstorm. There was a charge in the air. And I thought, what is happening? Other things that there were audible things. Toys were crashing over in the middle of the night. My kids would wake up crying. There was a different atmosphere. The one tangible thing that I did experience was one morning getting ready for work, stepping over that threshold between the kitchen and the lounge room where the little boy was originally seen. I stepped over the threshold, and a massive candle holder that had sat for years without any movement on top of a cabinet in the lounge room crashed over in front of me, narrowly missed me, and clattered to the wooden floorboards and made a great racket. And I swore and went, and turned on the light, because I think it was a winter's morning, it was quite dark. I turned on the light, and the light bulb exploded into, hundreds of shards. And I was just alarmed. I thought, what is that? So there was certainly this buildup of energy, and I'd never experienced a light bulb exploding prior to that or since. So that was the only time, and it happened directly after that big candle holder fell. And so then I began to think, what is going on here? Like, why did my husband, who's a tradesman, he's not given to any of this, why has he suddenly begun to see spirits? Now, through my work at Who magazine, I was the books editor, and that's where I worked for the best part of 2 decades, when it was a very good magazine, less so now, sadly, but I'm not there anymore. But through my work there, I had access to lots of books, and I would interview lots of people. And one of the women that I interviewed was a woman who was known for being kind of Australia's ghost whisperer, and she would go to homes and do these clearings. And she ended up coming to our home, and she did a clearing. And she walked in and said, oh, yeah, there he is. In our son's room, she said there was an old man. Now, she did what she had to do, and she described the process as sending them to the light and all of that. And certainly things quietened right down after that. So that was my experience of that. But it was I guess it was a real turning point, because as I said, I've always been fascinated by these experiences, but now I had this idea for a book. I thought, well, if that's happened to me, who else is experiencing this kind of stuff? And who else is meditating and then suddenly awakening the ability to see the spirit world? And what are these spirits? And I would like to write a book collecting these stories. And to give it a little bit of a different angle, I thought I would collect women's experiences. So that's what I did, and I called it Spirit Sisters. And that book came out in 2009, and I was able to, through my work at Who, I was lucky. I had access to meeting with publishers and all sorts of things, and it all happened very quickly, which really in retrospect just lets me know that it was meant to be, that book. And so that was a surprise hit, Spirit Sisters. It was a bestseller, and it went on to be published in England the following year. And so based on its success, I went on to write Where Spirits Dwell, which came out in 2011. Oh, sorry, I'll show you. So this is the second book, Where Spirits Dwell, and this one was all about hauntings. So I looked at Australian hauntings mainly, but there's also a chapter where I went to England with my sister and we experienced a few things there. And then after that, a few years later, came Love Never Dies, the last in the non-fiction trilogy. And this one's all experiences of loved ones only. So this is the tearjerker of the trilogy. It's a very emotional book, and it's full of, as all my books are, it's full of first-hand accounts of experiencing the spirit world. But this one is essentially our loved ones only. So that was that. So many experiences, so many books over the years. And, it was funny because after Where Spirits Dwell came out in 2011, that was kind of GFC time. There was a real downturn in publishing. We lost a couple of key bookstores around the world, not just in Australia. So Where Spirits Dwell did nowhere near as well as Spirit Sisters. And so there was a lag between Where Spirits Dwell being published and Love Never Dies coming out. And it's funny how that happened. I ended up having another publisher approach me to say, oh, I'd like to talk about an idea about a book about the loved ones. And I went, oh, that's so funny. That's what I've always wanted to do, but it wasn't going to happen at my other publisher. So I went to Pan Macmillan for that third one. But again, it just makes me think, well, that work wasn't done. That book had to come out. And so that was that. And then it was just kind of quiet. And then I, just thinking about what I would do next, and always fascinated though. I'm always reading about different experiences of the spirit world and curious. My curiosity never died really. And I went on to think about a podcast. Now, I began to think about it when the 10th anniversary of Spirit Sisters was dawning last January 2019. And I launched the podcast in May of that year as a passion project. And my idea was to try and actually track down some of the amazing women that I'd spoken to in Spirit Sisters and the amazing people that I've interviewed in subsequent books and revisit them for a podcast. So that's the idea, as well as unearthing new stories. And based on my work with the Spirit Sisters podcast, which is, when I began, I thought, well, I'll put the episodes out fortnightly, but it's kind of quite challenging, and sometimes closer to a month will pass before the new episode is refreshed. But nonetheless, it's there, and I get lovely feedback on it, and people tell me, please continue. So I will continue. And interestingly enough, doing that out of love and wanting to share these experiences because I am so passionate about their healing power, and also I just believe so passionately in the power of sharing our stories, So just from that energy, I was then approached by the editor of New Idea, who said, we would like to do a podcast on our Pacific Magazine's network, and we'd like it to be like Spirit Sisters. So I came up with the Ghost Files, and that launched in July last year. And it's been fantastic. That is a weekly podcast, and I write an accompanying column in New Idea magazine as well, where I talk about who I meet through the podcast and my guests. And I'll tell you now about some of the stories in my Ghost Files life. Later, if anyone wants to know, I can talk about stories throughout my books as well, but there are just millions of them. So in order to narrow it down, I've just gone to the Ghost Files for now. So it started with podcast 1 was an interview with a young guy called Matt in his 30s. And he had a story about seeing a spirit early one morning, and he had never seen a spirit before. Now, the Ghost Files podcast is essentially episodes of up to half an hour, and it really lends itself to one story being unfolded throughout the episode. But I have also spoken to people who, have more than one and will touch on them. But I think the format of one story being told works really well for this show. And that was my first guest. He told this experience of living in a share house in Sydney, and early one morning he woke up and there was a man standing at the end of his bed who he could see very clearly. And what was fascinating was that this man was looking with great curiosity at a small table that Matt had at the end of the bed, where he'd recently traveled to Mexico and he'd brought back a statue of the Virgin of Guadalupe, who's a deity, the Virgin Mary that they worship there. And this spirit was very curiously just checking out this statue. And again, it just tells us it doesn't tell us, it raises so many fascinating questions about the nature of consciousness and, and multi-dimensions and all sorts of stuff, really. But Matt said that then Matt was quite awake at this point. He sort of sat up a bit and was watching this man. And it's also interesting how often, or how not so often, fear plays a part. In this case, Matt wasn't afraid either. And the man, the ghost, looked up from his, investigating this statue, and he made eye contact with Matt, and then he just vanished. He vanished. And I remember Matt saying the way he disappeared was from the outside in. So he just kind of disintegrated. Now, and then Matt just woke up and went on with his day. And the number of times that I've interviewed people who tell me that then after something so strange happens, that they will just go on with their day as if nothing has gone on, is fascinating to me. Hollywood would kind of have us think that people do flee in the middle of the night. And yes, I've heard perhaps one or two stories where that's happened, but they're certainly in the minority. Most of the time, people just get up and continue with their day. There was another guest from the Ghost Files, a lovely woman called Danielle, who has become a friend, and I have become friends with a couple of of my interviewees, and the lovely Faye, who's on here today, is another one who's become a dear friend. And both of these ladies, Danielle as with Faye, are examples of women who've had these abilities ever since they were children, and they just have what one paranormal investigator described to me once as simply expanded awareness. Now, yes, we can use the term psychic medium, but he said, this guy, Rob was his name, he said, it's expanded awareness, Karina. And I went, oh, okay. And that was when I was researching where spirits dwell. But this lady, Danielle, one of them, and she told the story on the Ghost Files of seeing a little ghost girl who woke her up one night when she just appeared by the side of her bed. Now, Danielle has not had children in this life. However, she is one of the most beautiful, compassionate souls that I've ever come across. And I think this compassion in her is just so big that it reaches out beyond the veil, And certainly other people that I've spoken to throughout my interviews have borne that theory out too, because it just seems so simple. Well, you care about people on earth, that when that care is so true and so authentic and so profound, it simply continues to reach out. Now, that's just something that has occurred to me, and I thought I'd share it with you all. You might find it interesting, but the trait of compassion just seems to extend and cover the living and the dead. And in this case with Danielle, this little girl appeared to her about the age of 4 or 5, a beautiful child with big blue eyes and 2 little plaits, and she wanted help. And what began with this appearance evolved into a bond that they formed. And so Danielle would see this child intermittently over a period of about a month, and eventually, in a psychic way, much like the people who come and clear your home, Danielle was able to assist her to cross over to the light and to find her loved ones in the light. And that was a process that went on and, as I said, and took a few weeks. And Danielle is not somebody who's up on stages, sharing or charging money for her gifts. And not that there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying that there are these anonymous people in our midst, many of them, who have these abilities. And Faye's another one, and maybe Faye can come on later and tell us more about her story. But Faye's got a fascinating story of living in the Solomon Islands, and her home there being haunted by the spirit of a man who'd committed an atrocious murder, a rape and murder of a young woman. And Faye's house was very audibly and physically haunted by this man and his footsteps. But the interesting twist is that the man was actually alive, the killer, and in jail. But that event was in a way kind of replaying, and we can talk later about why that was the case, you know, and why houses are haunted, and whether it takes a person with this expanded awareness in a home to kind of trigger it or ignite the haunting, if you like. Another lady I interviewed on the Ghost Files called Bella. Now, she told a story that had sort of all the hairs lifting up on the back of my neck, and it was about a Ouija board. Well, she was obsessed with the Ouija board when she was in her 30s, and that led to something terrifying coming through. The way it all started was quite chilling. And seemingly quite innocent, but when you look back, you wonder, was this a warning? So she described, Bella, to me, a moment that won't be unfamiliar to any parent that's listening. So she walked past a room where her 3-year-old daughter was playing, and Bella just leaned against the doorway and was admiring her toddler and thinking, isn't she gorgeous? When suddenly the little girl, who was just sort of, you know, playing with her dolls or doing whatever, she got up, and Bella described it as she surged forward. So it very much looked like someone had pushed her. And Bella just stood watching, you know, in shock, but just not, she didn't run away or anything. She just watched this play out. And then she saw, and I've just got the notes here. So she was standing up in the middle of the room, and she surged forward, the toddler, and said, "Don't, mummy, you pushed me." And then Bella said to me that it really looked like someone had pushed her, but she said, no, darling, I didn't push you. And the child said, "Mummy, Doreen just whispered to me." Now, as Bella explained, the only elderly person in their lives at that point that they knew was a lady called Doreen. So from that, Bella later gathered that the voice that had spoken to her was an elderly person's voice. And she said, "Doreen told me, Bible, Bible." And that's like the hairs lifted up on the back of my neck. And this was a family that didn't have any real spiritual grounding. They didn't talk about the Bible. They didn't talk about God. They didn't talk about these things. So why was this child saying that? And then what went on to happen was that Bella, she had 3 moments where she experienced very much Hollywood style bed shaking, like trembling. She lived in New Zealand, and she was a very articulate woman, and said, "Look, I'm used to earthquakes. I'm used to all of that." But this was not that. Everything in the room was still, and the bed was shaking. And when she initially wrote the email to me to introduce herself and just ask me about this story, she said, can we talk about it? But it has to be in the daytime, because I actually can't talk about it at night. So of course, you know, I was fascinated and wanted to hear this story immediately. But that also shows how impactful these experiences are, and how decades can pass and we will still, you know, talk about them and remember, and they've affected us one way or another. In this sense, for Bella, the fear was still very much apparent. So 3 times she went on to experience this bed shaking. She described it as, let's see, she woke up and thought it was an earthquake, and she sat up in bed, looked around, waiting to see if it was still shaking. And it was like something out of a horror movie. She said, "I would have thought I was going mad if it hadn't been that she had a friend staying in her home that day in a different room. And she woke up and she called this friend, and the friend came to the room, and together they watched this bed shake for a good 5 minutes or so. It just didn't stop." So that was the beginning of three kind of events, and it culminated with the appearance of a horrific demonic creature hovering over Bella's face one night. And she understood, though, later, again, like in retrospect, that was a warning, because she had been obsessed with the Ouija board, and her obsession had gotten to the point where she wanted to play it most days. She was passionate about pushing it onto people and showing them, look, this is what can happen. And what was an interesting postscript to Bella's story is that at the end of every Ghost Files interview, I will ask my guest, what can an encounter with the dead teach us about living? And Bella said, be positive, be kind. Not that she wasn't a kind person, but she said she had been putting so much of her energy into this negative, because even if the message that life goes on after death is positive, what was negative was her obsession and the imbalance in her life, and her wanting, in a sense, to control others by being so passionate about pushing this idea onto them. All of that was not right, and it was out of balance, and the result was seeing this horrific creature she feels. So that's Bella. There was a lady called Virginia who was a retired, well, she was a policewoman, but she was out with post-traumatic stress. She had some horrific things go on in her life and in her career, and she'd seen a lot. And she told a story of one day walking in, I think it was the Blue Mountains, with a friend, and she saw she described him as a beautiful elderly gentleman walking towards her, and he was just aglow in this beautiful light. And she smiled at him, and he smiled at her, and then he went past. And then when she mentioned him to her companion, her friend said, well, I didn't see anything. What did you see? And it was only later that it emerged that this man was kind of like an angel, although Virginia made the link that he was her ancestor, he was her grandfather, and he was coming to let her know that she was about to experience horror, but he was going to be with her, and that love and support is always available for her. And yes, the horror that Virginia went on to experience was an assault. She was sexually assaulted one day when she was at the beach by a man wielding a weapon. It's a truly horrific story. Virginia is actually going to come back on the Ghost Files in the next few weeks to talk about haunted police stations as well that she has worked out throughout her life. So again, somebody with disability, and it's manifested in different ways in her life. What else? Oh, Kelly Jo Hoffman came on to tell me a story, and I'll just find where I've printed it out here. 1 second, if I can find my papers. She told a story about so she was scrolling through Facebook one day, and she saw a mother had put a post up saying, oh, it was very sad. It was about her baby having died of a very rare brain cancer. And now this mother and her family were raising funds to raise awareness of this rare cancer so that other families, would not suffer. They could raise funds for research, etc. And what they were asking was that people who were interested dye their hair pink in honor of the baby who'd passed and of this cause. So this lady, Kelly Jo, thought, oh, I can do that. She was quite touched by this. She's a mother of 4, and it moved her. So she dyed her hair pink and shared the post and donated and all of that. A couple of weeks later, she decided to go and visit a friend. She just had this thought to visit this particular friend who lived a 2-hour drive away. So it wasn't close by, but she teed it up and off she went. And this friend also had young kids. So the two ladies were just having a chat, having coffee, the kids playing, when there was a knock at the door. Now, remember, this was 2 hours from Kelly Jo's house, and a friend that she didn't really see that often. The woman at the door was a stranger to Kelly Jo's friend and to Kelly Jo. And she said, look, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I'm a psychic, and I was booked to do a reading at a house a few houses down from here. And I actually cannot continue this reading because of this message that I have to deliver to the person with the pink hair. And I've been drawn here. And indeed, Kelly Jo had bright pink hair. And the two ladies stood there staring at this stranger, just absolutely aghast, and just they could not believe what was happening. And she went on to deliver very specific messages that were seemingly from this newborn to her family through Kelly Jo. Now, as you can imagine, Kelly Jo was absolutely stunned. She didn't know what to do with this information. Obviously, it's an extremely delicate matter of a child who's only recently passed. The family is grieving. She was very unsure about whether to pass on these messages or not. In the end, she worked up the courage. She messaged that particular Facebook page, and she said, look, can I please get the phone number for the lady that runs it, so the bereaved mum? Eventually, through me, one way or another, she didn't ask for the phone number. She said, I'm going to leave my number, and if it's possible, if this lady could call me. So weeks passed, and one day Kelly Jo was just about to pull out from the supermarket and her phone rang, and it was this lady. And Kelly Jo was able to pass on the extremely specific messages that were or intended for this bereaved mum. And I'm just trying to remember now what they are. And I have printed them out, but hang on just one sec. And it was very urgent that this message be delivered. The baby was very persistent. The details were very intimate. They had to do with items that were placed in the coffin with the baby, with all sorts of very specific things. And by the end of that conversation, both mothers were in absolute floods of tears, as you can imagine. But the mother thanked Kelly Jo for having the courage in the end to pass this on. So that's an extraordinary moment as well. We just kind of think, how did such a thing happen? And again, that's one of the more positive stories. I like to share positive stories on the podcast too. Sophie Tate's is a classic haunting story that I broadcast in January on the Ghost Files. It was such a long and detailed story. I had to do 2 episodes. I had to do it in 2 parts. Sophie is an extremely gifted storyteller, very articulate, very intelligent, and she sharply recalled all of the specific details of a haunting that she'd experienced when she was 24 years old and living in kind of the rental of her dreams on the Mornington Peninsula. And this was in 2002, and she had a very, very normal life, working at a dental surgery, but she was living in Melbourne and had to find a new home to live. And through one thing and another, she decided to move to the Mornington Peninsula to be closer to her sister, who'd just given birth to a baby. And Sophie had a horse, and she wanted to put it on a gisement nearby, and she found this seemingly dream rental, 2 bedrooms, view of the sea, cheap as chips. On the day of moving in, Sophie thought, I just don't understand why it's so cheap. This house must be haunted, she said. And those words would come back to haunt her indeed. A week later, now there's so much to Sophie's story, but I'll just share kind of the principal thing that happened that defined the haunting, and then so much more went on to happen. But so just a week after moving in, Sophie had invited a friend over. The plan was just to have a bite together before heading out to the local drive-in and catching a double feature. So the girls were laughing and listening to some music. Sophie went to great pains to say that she's not a drinker. She hadn't taken drugs throughout any of this. They were cooking and getting ready to go out, and then suddenly Sophie just glanced down at her leg, where the word die, D-I-E, had suddenly been kind of tattooed on her lower leg, huge. She said, it was under my knee and took up the whole leg, and it was big, perfect, solid black. But the die letters were white and written in a beautiful, this is how Sophie described it, a beautiful, very, very old calligraphy style writing. So the friend that was there, very logical, as is Sophie, she's very no nonsense. They thought, oh, look, I must have just leaned on an old newspaper. They went through every kind of method to eliminate any other possibility. In the end, they couldn't. The thing wouldn't come off or scrub off either. So Sophie took herself off to the movies with that thing stamped on her leg. She couldn't quite recall all these years later how eventually it went to leave her leg, but maybe it faded away. She couldn't remember that part, unfortunately. But anyway, that strange event proved to be the beginning of electrical malfunctions, appliances blowing up, her car engine blowing up without the car even being turned on. Sophie called it 4 months of, and in her words, mental abuse. She said this thing, and she called it an entity. She didn't believe the spirit or the force had ever been a human. In her words, this was something that had never, ever been human. But she was not welcome in the home, and it was going to let her know it. But she was very, very stubborn and would not leave. So anyway, so that's Sophie's story. If you wanted to listen to it, it's in January 20 and 27 is when it was broadcast on the Ghost Files in 2 parts. eventually peace returned to her life through, very interestingly, her dad, who was somebody who, he was an international pilot for a major airline, but there was a side of him that was very interested in this spirit world. And then we can sort of, you know, we can imagine that perhaps whatever gifts he had, or for want of a better word, Sophie then went on to inherit as well. But through his interest, he somehow knew how to get rid of this, and he went over to her house one day at the peak of it, and he indeed did get rid of it. Now, her story has elements where you get a bit frustrated because so much is happening and she's not seeking help, and she's thinking stubbornly in the way of a 20-something-year-old, nah, I can do this, I can get rid of it. And she doesn't ask for her father's help or anyone's help really until one point she sees a psychic, and the psychic tells her exactly what's happening and all of the things that she has to do to protect herself, and she ignores every single instruction. So that was Sophie Tate, one of the very popular Ghost Files guests. Most recently as well, just coming up to, we're nearly up to the hour, Rebecca Coombs, very lovely woman, shared a very fascinating story, and I'm having her back on the podcast soon to share another very interesting ghost story. But Rebecca told me about a weekend away in Bath in England, and she stayed in a haunted house. And at the time she worked for the owner of a very big women's fashion label in the UK, and he had lovely properties all around Europe, and there was one in Bath, and he would kindly allow the employees to have weekends there. And so she did with one weekend. And she said that she'd heard little whispers that it was haunted, but really didn't give much, short thrift to that. And so they got there, and she said that as soon as she saw the place, she knew that something was very wrong there. But she just, went in, and her friend was cooking. They were cooking, the ladies. And the first thing that happened was a bathroom down the hall with nobody in it. The taps were going on, the lock was opening and shutting, this very old-fashioned latch that you would physically need a hand to lift it up and down was vigorously moving. And again, they just thought, oh, well, nothing's going to ruin our weekend, basically, the young people. And so then, board games, dinner around the fire, all of that. Then Rebecca, her name, she was sharing a room with a friend, so 2 single beds, and the 2 ladies went to sleep. Rebecca was woken in the middle of the night with her face shoved down into the pillow. She was face down, couldn't breathe. Her first thought was, it's one of the boys playing a prank. It's a bad prank. I hate it. Get off me. But that was her first thought, because it was so very physical that she was being shoved down into into the pillow. Eventually that lifted, and she saw this vibrant blue light. Now, Rebecca's story is unlike any I've ever heard, because the energy that she saw was so tangible, and palpable and visible. This electric blue light zooming around the room, kind of that shape, that size, I think. Interestingly, it was zapping her. So she felt what she described as electrocution. It was painful. She said it was very painful, and it was zapping her, and she was afraid. And she was trying to turn on. So she could move at this point, and was wide awake and staring at this thing in her room, and was trying to wake her friend. Come on, wake up, when she was shouting out. The woman was, whether it was the wine or what, but she was gone. She could not awaken. So there's Rebecca with this huge blue light in the room, and being electrocuted at the same time, and trying to turn on other lights in the room. So the lamp didn't work, and the main switch in the room did not work. So she said the fear and the panic in her was just horrific. And she said, I cannot even convey how frightened I was. And that is certainly Hollywood style, this thing, like, the cliche of trying to turn on the light and it's not turning on. But this was no Hollywood story for Rebecca. So she did this thing, which I've heard time and again, this very, high-tech solution, which is to jump into bed and cover yourself with the covers. And that's what she did. And she was just, please, please, go away, go away, go away, go away. Suddenly she realized, saying this kind of mantra, please go away, please go away. She realized that blue light was gone. The pain in her body of the zapping was gone. And that a different kind of light was now in the room. And she thought, oh, goody, someone's turned on the light, is what was her first thought. And she peeked out and she saw two women. So she saw, she described them as maids. They were maids. There was an older one and a very young one. So a girl and a young woman. And they were dressed in what would, you know, she'd eventually realize was just old-fashioned maids' uniforms from Edwardian times. And they were looking at her with giving her great comfort. And with them came light. And that is what she had wanted. She had wanted light. And these ladies who appeared from the spirit world to assist Rebecca were giving her, they were imparting that light and comfort. And so comforted, in fact, was Rebecca through this, that she was able to go to sleep and then wake up the next day and continue with the weekend. And one thing that I did forget to tell you was that while this thing with the zapping and the blue light was going on, she was talking to it saying, look, we're just here for the weekend. Let us be. We'll be gone in a couple of days. I know you don't want us here, but we'll be gone. The next day, more happened. She was lying in the daytime. She did not feel well. It was as if she had no energy. She was completely flattened by the encounter the previous night. And she was lying by the fire in the lounge room. And she saw again a form appear from the corner of the room, and it was taunting her. And she understood this. There was something in there that did not want them there. And so anyway, so that was Rebecca's story. Eventually the weekend ended and she left. So just to finish on a couple of others, there was a wonderful story just recently in the last few weeks that a lady called Celeste shared with me of a shared death experience. Now, I don't know if anyone's familiar with that term. It's when a loved one is dying and for some reason the person experiencing this is permitted to go part way to the light or to the other realm with them and experience it. And for Celeste, my guest, it happened in a dream. So she was 13 years old and her sister had been killed by a drunk driver, actually. And her sister, sorry, I think Celeste was 12 and her sister was 13 who died. And she had been on her push bike and had been hit by a drunk driver in this small country town that they lived in. And the girl was in a coma. She was on life support. And at the time that this happened, Celeste and her siblings went to say goodbye. They knew that she would probably not awaken from this. And her parents said, come and say goodbye to your sister. They did that. She went to stay at someone else's house while her parents stayed at the sister's bedside. And it was during the night that this happened, and Celeste fell asleep and was given a dream where she was with her sister and they were in this beautiful place. And her description of it is not unlike, you know, the descriptions of heaven or the afterlife that you hear from near-death experiences. It was just this most beautiful garden with the colours that are unbelievable, that we do not have the language to express here. And the love and the peace that was infusing this space was such that there is no language to express that here either. And in this experience, Celeste was hand in hand with her sister. She encountered late loved ones, including her grandmother, who she'd never known, and another little friend who died of leukemia, who seemed in the peak of health. And so this was this afterlife realm. And she begged God, as she described it as God, to let her stay. But then before she knew it, she was back in her body and waking up sobbing. She was sobbing and she said, I can't remember her sister's name now, but she said she's dead. And minutes later, her siblings, not minutes later, immediately her siblings that were around her, she was part of a big family, lots of kids. They said, how did you know that? We just got the call. She passed away. So I love that story, and I'm really interested in near-death experiences, shared death experiences. I just feel that there's so much hope that they can give us. And that's probably, I think I'll probably leave it at that. What do you think, Cheryl, for now? Or how are we going for time?
That's fine, yeah. What I'll do now, first of all, I want to say thank you for all that information. Some of those stories are very... many of us have heard things very similar, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, look, Karina, thank you so much.
Thank you
for spending the afternoon with us, and thanks everyone else for coming.
Yes, thank you everyone.
It's been great. I'm going to unmute you all. And yeah, and you can say your goodbyes or whatever it is that you want. And I really appreciate it. I'm so glad this has gone so smoothly for our first inaugural meeting.
Good. Well done, Cheryl. Thanks, Karina.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone. It was lovely to meet you
Absolutely.
all.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you.
Karina. Thanks,
Thank you,
Cheryl.
Karina.
Thank you very much, Karina.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much, everyone.
Bye.
And I will post that particular thing on the Afterlife Discussions Facebook page, that little clip, and see you all again in a month.
Indeed.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Cheryl.